I came to Emory in 1985, as you heard, as a stowaway in the briefcase of my great mentor, Harold J. Berman, who was mentioned, Emory's first Woodruff professor of law. Berman and I had been working intensely together at Harvard Law School in the early 1980s when I was completing my legal studies and helping him with his great books on law and revolution. What brought Berman to Emory was President Jim Laney's compelling vision of the new university that he was building here with the remarkable new Woodruff gift. Two features of Laney's vision stood out to Berman and, by extension, to me. One was Emory's robust embrace of interdisciplinary scholarship and teaching. A lot of universities were preaching interdisciplinary rhetoric, but at Emory, Laney made clear, it was already part of our academic ecosystem. That was clear from a whole series of new interdisciplinary programs and centers and institutes already in place, from the ILA to the Yerkes Primate Center to the Carter Center and much more. Berman had spent almost 40 frustrating years at Harvard trying to break academic silos and taboos and build interdisciplinary bridges and programs, and Emory's new vision offered by President Laney was deeply, deeply compelling. The second feature was Laney's explicit rejection of the secularization hypothesis that was so prominent in higher education at the time. The dominant narrative in the elite academy was that religion was the shrinking refuge of the superstitious, and it would soon die out and give way to a brave new world of science and technology and secular reason. Laney believed the opposite, that religion would again thrive and, for better or worse, would become a major factor in modern life. Indeed, in his more wistful remarks, Laney predicted that the new millennium would face a great new awakening of religion, global in its sweep, striking in its diversity, and frightening in its power. What a prescient and poignant prophecy that has proved to be. But already a half century earlier, Laney had called on Emory to prepare itself. And almost alone among major research universities, he called on the faculty to include concerted studies of religion in all departments and divisions of knowledge, rather than sequester religion to the seminary or to the Department of Religion. This was not an effort to proselytize any form of faith, but to seek to understand in a nuanced way the phenomenon of religion from multiple disciplinary and professional perspectives. And here was the catalyst for all manner of new Emory programs in religion and business and medicine and nursing and public health and politics, and happily in religion and law. When Berman heard that compelling new vision of interdisciplinary legal and religious study, he packed his bags to move from Harvard to Emory. And I, as a stowaway, jumped into one of the bigger bags to join him here. And we came to join Emory to join another former Harvard Law and Divinity student, Frank Alexander, who had already started a prototype law and religion program. And there were other distinguished faculty already in place that were nurturing this interdisciplinary work, folks like David Blumenthal and Rebecca Chopp and John Gunneman of Brooks Holyfield and Gary Hawk and Stephen Tipton, Carl Holliday, and many others. I joined these pioneering Emory faculty in 1985, and I became director of the Law and Religion program, as it was called then, in 1987, and they've been stuck with me ever since. And together with my colleagues, we gradually built up the program, offering joint degree programs and single degree concentrations in law and religion, cross-listed courses on topics like religious freedom, history of church-state relations, religious legal systems, law and theology, comparative ethics, comparative hermeneutics, and more. Internships and fellowships for students and for postdocs, public lectures and public conferences, research projects and publications, all the core structural features that are still in place 40 plus years later. From the start, we faced ample headwinds, as any new interdisciplinary adventure would and should face. Even at Emory, with its Methodist origins and sitting at the buckle of the Bible Belt, religion was still thought by many to be a taboo academic subject, a conversation stopper, as Richard Rorty once put it. Especially our law school colleagues worry that we are introducing a soft subject into the rigorous study of law. We are riding in on Trojan horses, carrying pernicious Christian teachings designed to pervert jurisprudence and to convert the unsuspecting. We were violating elementary constitutional principles of separation of church and state and epistemological starting points of separating is and ought and fact and value. And we were distracting our students and our colleagues from what was considered real interdisciplinary work of the day, which was focused on law and economics and law and hard science. It was critical for us to prove ourselves, not only at Emory, but in the burgeoning world of interdisciplinary legal study altogether. And with the Emory administration and faculty support, and with generous new funding raised from Pew and Ford and Lilly and Luce and McDonald and other foundations that Glenn Kellum opened the door for us to get to, we were able gradually to map the new field of law and religion study and to break some of its first rows and its first frontiers. In this field, we study what we call the religious dimensions of law, the legal dimensions of religion, and the interaction of legal and religious ideas and institutions, methods and practices, historically and today in the West and well beyond. We start with the premise that at a fundamental level, religion gives law its spirit and inspires its adherence to ritual, tradition, and justice. Law, in turn, gives religion its structure and encourages its devotion to order, organization, and orthodoxy. Law and religion share such ideas as fault, obligation, and covenant, and such methods as ethics, rhetoric, and hermeneutics. Law and religion also balance each other by counterposing justice and mercy, rule and equity, discipline and love. It is this dialectical interaction that gives these two disciplines and these two dimensions of life their vitality and their strength. To quote again from Harold Berman, without law at its backbone, religion slowly crumbles into shallow spiritualism. Without religion at its heart, law gradually crumbles into empty and sometimes brutal formalism. Even in contemporary Western society, the laws of the secular state retain strong religious dimensions. Every legitimate legal system has what Lon Fuller once called an inner morality, a set of attributes that bespeak its justice, fairness, its ultimate transcendence. Ideally, state rules like divine laws are publicly proclaimed and known, generally applicable, uniform, stable, understandable, non-retroactive, consistently enforced, albeit inevitably with equity. Every legitimate legal system, furthermore, has an inner religiosity, a set of attributes that are designed to command the obedience, the respect, even the reverence of both political subjects and political officials, at least those not named Donald Trump. Like religion, law has authority. Written or spoken sources, texts, or oracles, which are considered to be decisive and obligatory in themselves. Like religion, law has tradition, a continuity of language, practice, and institutions, a theory of precedent and preservation, an ethic of abandoning the time-tested principles and practices of the past only with trepidation, only with explanation. Like religion, law has ritual and liturgy, the ceremonial procedures and elaborate pageantry and ornate language of the legislature, the courtroom, and the legal document that reflect and dramatize deeply held social feelings about the value and validity of the legal order, and that underscore the reality that justice must not only be done, but also must be seen and heard to be done. Even in modern Western society, in turn, religion maintains a legal dimension, an inner structure of legality, which gives religious lives and religious communities their coherence, their order, their social form. Legal habits of the heart structure the inner spiritual life and discipline of religious believers, from the reclusive hermit to the aggressive zealot. Legal ideas of justice, order, atonement, restitution, responsibility, obligation, and many others pervade the theological doctrines of religious traditions. Legal structures and processes, the halakha in Judaism, the canon law in Christianity, the Sharia in Islam, the Dharma in Hinduism, define and govern religious communities and the distinctive beliefs, rituals, mores that they hold dear. To be sure, the spheres and sciences of law and religion have on occasion both converged and contradicted each other. Every major religious tradition has known both theonomism and antinomianism, the excessive legalization and the excessive spiritualization of religion. Every major legal tradition has known both theocracy and totalitarianism, the excessive sacralization and the excessive secularization of law. But the dominant reality in most eras and most cultures is that law and religion relate dialectically. Every major religious tradition struggles to come to terms with law by striking a balance between the rational and the mystical, the prophetic and the priestly, the structural and the spiritual. Every major legal tradition, in turn, struggles to link its formal structures and processes with the beliefs and the ideals of its people. This is the field of study that my colleagues and I have had the privilege to help break open over the past 40+ years. We've been privileged to work with scores of wonderful Emory faculty throughout the campus, and now more than 1,600 scholars around the world who are part of our scholarly network. Today, our community, called the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, includes some 60 center faculty and fellows, several postdocs, visitors, and student fellows each year, and a few hundred students whom we approach each year in our classrooms and degree programs and research projects. And what a wonderful run we have had together over the 40+ years that we've been together. Together, we have directed some 24 international projects on the fundamentals of faith, freedom, and family. We have built new bridges of legal conversation within and across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and some Asian religions too. We have hosted 12 major international conferences and convened scores of public forums that have drawn tens of thousands of participants and online viewers. We have published more than 400 volumes and thousands of articles out of our projects. We edit 5 book series in 5 major languages. We published a leading law and religion journal in the world and the innovative digital platform called Canopy Forum. A number of our graduates are now leaders of the legal, religious, and academic professions, including a score of them serving as law professors here and abroad. One of our center's hallmarks over the decades, especially in constructing our research projects, has been to build on its traditional strengths while venturing into and trying to map cutting-edge issues of law and religion. We try to anticipate and to analyze issues before they become politically and culturally and legally hot. Before a topic becomes a flashpoint of the culture wars or a soundbite fury on social media, we try to define some of the deep questions, to build some of the first networks of conversation partners, to put in place some of the resources and literature, and then step back as others get into the fray and eventually take over leadership, sometimes at loggerheads with others. So we were studying Christianity and democracy in earnest and in programs around the world before the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, and African colonial regimes gave way. We were studying religion, human rights, and religious freedom before they became such a controversial centerpiece of global and local activity. We were studying the problem and promise of proselytism before the newly opened lands of the East and the global South began in the new millennium to close their doors to foreign faiths. We were deeply debating issues of sex, marriage, family, and children and world religions before the explosion of our modern culture wars over sex and sexual identity and sexual unions. We were studying the place of faith-based legal systems in liberal democracies before the shrill anti-Sharia debates after 9/11 and the anti-Catholic canon law backlashes after the exposures of pedophilia. Our programs and our literature and our networking have provided support and edification at the foundations of these new movements and these new controversies, with a good bit of our work still available in print and translated into a dozen languages. A second of our center's hallmarks has been to welcome every serious perspective on law, religion, and society, and to engage it respectfully, robustly, and responsibly. The center has no party line, no methodological litmus test, no political agenda, no litigation or lobbying arm. We are a major research and educational center and interested in all serious ideas. We foster and expect earnest debate, excellent scholarship, inclusive membership, and authentic identity from our faculty, students, and visitors. We have welcomed to our law and religion community and conversations all manner of diverse celebrities. President Jimmy Carter, Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Bishop Gene Robinson, Ambassador Mary Ann Glendon, the Honorable John T. Noonan Jr., Tibetan President Lobsang Sangjay, and many others. And we have welcomed hundreds, if not thousands, of major scholars from the center, the right, and the left, from every continent save Antarctica, where penguin law and religion has not yet quite caught on. It has been deeply gratifying to see the growing interest in law and religion study around the world. When Hal Berman and Frank Alexander and I and David Blumenthal and others started this work at Harvard and then at Emory in the early 1980s, we were almost alone. Now 55 centers and institutes of law and religion have popped up on campuses around the globe. When we started, there was only a small handful of thin and primitive journals and books in law and religion. Now there are 37 periodicals and scores of major blogs. And over the past 20 years in English alone, there have been 1,750 book titles published in law and religion, putting aside all the work done in other major languages. In the United States, virtually all law schools now have at least a basic course in religious liberty or church-state relations, as it's sometimes called. A growing number of law schools now teach courses in Christian canon law and Jewish law, Islamic law, and natural law, and many take up law and religion themes in their traditional topics of public, private, penal, and procedural law. Religion is no longer just the hobby horse of isolated and peculiar professors, principally in their twilight years and suddenly concerned about their eternal life. It is no longer just the preoccupation of religiously chartered law schools or religiously observant law professors. Religion now stands alongside economics and philosophy and literature and politics and history and all the other disciplines as a valid and valuable conversation partner with law. The most pressing topics in this ever-expanding field of law and religion study are mostly predictable for you at this point. Individual and corporate religious freedom, viewed in domestic and regional and international perspective, and the subject of thousands of cases every year coming out of apex courts throughout the world. Law, religion, and human rights more generally, including historical and philosophical contributions of the world religions to the cultivation and to the abridgment of various rights and liberties. The law and theology of mixed institutions, of families, churches, charities, and families, schools, and charities, each with spiritual and temporal dimensions, and each subject to ongoing jurisdictional battles between religious and political communities over control and membership. Faith-based legal systems and their foundational roles in the development of the secular legal systems around them and their governance of their own voluntary faithful. The influences of theology and religious ideas on law and legal thought, and in turn, the influence of law and legal thought on theology and religious ideas. And ongoing conversations about natural law, natural rights, and the interaction between our scientific and legal and religious understandings of nature, comparative legal and religious professionalism, how we cultivate and model the activities of these two fundamental guilds, comparative hermeneutics and semiotics and philology and parsing authoritative legal and religious texts, the place of ritual and ceremony in the enactment of law and politics, and more. Christian and Jewish scholars have been among the leaders of the law and religion field in the past half century. But happily now, there are growing scholarly guilds studying law and religion in Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, Confucianism, and various indigenous traditions too. Professor Sheth, we could use some English-speaking Jain scholars of law and religion to join us in this enterprise. Scholars from these various religious and legal traditions have already learned a great deal from each other and have cooperated in developing richer and more nuanced mutual understandings. This comparative, cooperative, interreligious inquiry into the fundamentals of law, politics, and society needs to continue, especially as the world struggles to discover and create proper, responsible, and effective constraints on new vicious forms of religious fundamentalism and extremism and new vicious forms of political nationalism and, I dare say, fascism, if I may use that word. What a blessing it has been to be part of this global scholarly enterprise. I've been privileged to work with tens of thousands of scholars and fellows and students and readers and audience members around the world and to publish with a score of wonderful publishers. My colleagues and I have been tremendously blessed by the several foundations that have entrusted us with their generous benefaction, folks that Glenn Kellum has put open to us in his wonderful work over the years as Director of Institutional Advancement. Little of this work in law and religion would have been possible without the rock-solid support and cooperation of Emory University. Interdisciplinary work like this, especially about religion, would be impossible to do at major research universities at home and abroad. At Emory, work like this is not only possible, it is inevitable and expected. Emory has allowed us to create a small steeple of scholarly excellence to make the university a bit more visible on the national and international horizon. It has allowed us to become a hub in a global network of law and religion scholarship, featuring thousands of faculty on all continents. And it has provided us with the space, with the time, and with the resources to create an inventive laboratory to rethink some of the fundamentals of our universal solvents of human living, law and religion. It has been a joy for me to direct this effort for the past 40-odd years, and now to build the next generation of leaders to take over. I hope the good Lord gives me 40 more years to continue to contribute to this work, even if there are now new directors and others to take over. But I give abundant thanks for every day I've had so far and whatever more days I have to give to this enterprise. And when those days are over, I hope you will accept my application to be a member of this illustrious Emeritus College. Thank you so much. Okay, good to hear. So now is the fun part where you have difficult questions to put to Professor Sheth and easy softball questions to put to me, and we can engage in a little conversation together. So I rolled out a big old map. I wasn't quite sure what to do. Glenn said I was supposed to do an autobiography, and I just said, my Calvinist, I'm very proud of my humility, and I would not allow myself to describe my own story, but I thought the story put the context of what Emory offers. Please.
Now, history is storytelling, and I'm interested in the story you tell about the evolution of law and religion as a presence and legal education, starting there with Emory. But I'm wondering if it would be reasonable to say that instead of the history sounding like you and others sort of brought religion to the law school, but rather you brought a means or maybe a lens for those who were there already to see what had existed for a long time and was simply being unveiled.
Yep.
I'm just thinking about the sort of the spin on history. Would that be a reasonable thing to say?
A very reasonable thing to say, and you could say that for the prior 3 millennia as well. I mean, law and religion as two great universal solvents of human living have been in conversation and contestation from the very beginning. That's just embedded into how we think about our organized societies. And the scholarship around that, the thinking about it, the reflections that we get in the academy and in more popular life have been a part of the tradition for a long time. What occurs in the course of the early 20th century is the positivization of knowledge and the desire to increasingly divide knowledge and teaching into special silos, each of them doing their own thing, even though in those silos there were people in the religion and history and politics and law school that were interested in these law and religion questions, but did not have the methodological means or the institutional incentive to be able to put them together in any serious way. And one thing that Jim Laney's compelling vision, I think, offered was a way of building bridges without betraying the silo understanding of education. And one thing that he did by unleashing that is to have people that were curious, the people that you mentioned were already in place, to have a means by which they could come together around common questions. And in many ways, that's all the Law and Religion Center has been. It's an enabler of people to engage in the interdisciplinary conversations, interreligious conversations, intercultural conversations, international conversations, of which they have sometimes been a part avocationally, of sometimes of which they've been a part with guilds around the world, and to bring that home to Emory. And then one of the most interesting experiments we engaged in was creating these seminars in law and religion. Professor Blumenthal was part of one of those early on. And we would just bring people together from 20 different departments on campus, including all the hard sciences and soft sciences and all the humanities and social sciences and the professional schools, and bring them together for common conversations. Jim Gustafson had done that in the Ethics Center. We are doing that in law and religion. And these were deeply congenial conversations, because in many ways, we all come with our own particular disciplinary lens. We all come with to change the metaphor, our own toolboxes of engagement and analysis. And if you have a big question, like justice, like faith, like order, like discipline, you need that multitude of different perspectives and disciplines to be able to engage it responsibly. And you learn from each other. And one of the beautiful things that we have discovered over the years is that when you bring people from multiple faiths, multiple disciplines, multiple confessions together, you learn so much from each other. And that's not just idle cant. It's not just the rhetoric we put on our interdisciplinary brochures and ignore. It's actually real. And that's been really wonderful to do and find and discover and build here at Emory. No question. Please, Professor Robbins, sir.
John, thanks. As you were talking and putting together this picture, I was trying to reconstruct in my mind a kind of history of the relation of religion and law, going back to like Sumer and Babylonia and then, you know, the emergence of things like the Hammurabi Code.
Sure.
And then a movement through the emergence of Israel and its focus on Torah as center of life, et cetera. And then we finally get down to Reformation and for Luther, of course, first trained in law and then moving into religion. And you have introduced now positivism at the beginning of the 20th century that separated things. And then, of course, toward the end of the 20th century, we have social sciences that begin to come in. How are historians of religion and law now characterizing the phase that we are going through now? Is it focused a lot on social media, or have moved beyond social sciences into cognitive sciences or network sciences, or if you were giving a map of the history of religion and law, how would you proceed?
So, big, hard question. Yes, historians are actively at work in this field. Part of what they're doing is mapping the story you told in the premise of your question, which is this ancient world all the way through to the 20th century, and recognizing all the different ways by which law and religion as categories, as methods, as institutional structures, as ways of being and knowing and doing interact in all these different civilizations, and using a kind of binocular of law and religion to bring into focus things that hitherto have been separated. The religious historians did their stuff, the cultural historians did their stuff, the anthropologists did stuff, the legal historians did their stuff, and bring them together. And that kind of synchronized and syncretic legal history and religious history has been a very healthy development in the last 20, 30 years of scholarship. Berman was exemplary in that respect, but there's now a substantial guild doing law and religion in the Western tradition. We still have to do a better job of it, in at least the Anglophone literature, of the Asian traditions, of the Islamic traditions, of some of the other traditions, but that's growing. That's a powerful new tool, and there are some major scholars out there at elite universities that are doing that work. I think the mapping of the 20th and 21st century has been a mapping in part of the history of education in the West. When the first universities were built in the 11th and 12th century, they had three major divisions of law, theology, and medicine. And it was expected until the 18th or 19th century that a learned person was learned in all three, and that one learned the methods, one learned the institutions, one learned the practices that attached to all three. And care for the soul, the body, and the mind were thought to be an expedient part of what a quote unquote Renaissance person would learn along the way. Mapping that, and then mapping the gradual dissociation of those three departments and the gradual fracturing of knowledge and education in the 20th century, including in legal education and religious education, is what the religious and legal historians have really been mapping out, have been spending time kind of telling that story. In Western universities, university by university, we have all these university histories that have emerged in Europe especially, but also in North America, but also talking about it more generally as theories of knowledge and looking at how knowledge itself has been dissociated. One of the interesting stories of the later 20th century and early 21st century that historians are now taking up in earnest is this new great awakening of religion at the turn of the millennium, and the explosion of new and newly accidented, exotic new combinations of religious life that have emerged in the northern frost belts, where non and yet and no to religion is pretty common among the elite, but actually at the sociological level, at the local level, you have an extraordinary explosion of law and religion, of religious life and its impact on law. But people are also now doing global histories and looking at what's happening in Asia, what's happening in global South, what's happening in Latin America and Africa, and the law and religion story that the West went through with or without the Enlightenment is a story that's also being now told about all the other groups out there around the world who are regionally or religiously or culturally, linguistically tied together. And that is being still mapped out. We don't have definitive histories yet, but if you read somebody like Lawrence Friedman, in American Law of the 20th century, you can kind of get one sociologist's take on this. If you read somebody like Stuart Banner, you'll hear a story like the rise and fall of the legal profession. If you read Tony Krollman, A Nation of Lawyers, you'll watch again this kind of ebbing and flowing of the legal profession in conversation and contestation, and now in cooperation with the religious profession. A lot of those kind of books out there. Mary Ann Glendon's book, The Forum and the Tower, gives you a kind of North American and Western European view. And that book is a kind of warning about the, before we've had the explosion of the last few years in our politics, and a warning about the responsibility of the legal and religious professions to hold the kind of reins of civilization tightly, given what's coming up. And her worry is pernicious globalization. Her worry is undue specialization, and which are in tension. Globalization, which has this macro, and then specialization, which has this incapacity to deal with the macro. And her Forum and Tower book kind of tells that story quite well. There's a lot of other literature out there happy to share with you, but those kind of give you a few of the high points of late. Professor Blumenthal, my old friend, who's, can I tell a story about Professor Blumenthal? So he has been a wonderful, wonderful friend since I got to the campus. And he welcomed me as Hal Berman's research toady when I first got here. I always took my work seriously. I always welcomed me into his home with his beloved bride, Ursula. I always encouraged me to be authentic to my own Christian faith while being authentic to his own Jewish faith. And one of the most poignant examples of that was when we moved into the neighborhood here, a few doors down from David and Ursula. And he came to the door with a jug of milk and a loaf of freshly baked challah bread. You have now reached the land of milk and honey. This was Emory University. My old friend, it's lovely to be with you again. Please, I'm sorry to embarrass you.
First of all, thank you for your very kind words. Although I need to add to that, it was you who did all the work. But I want to raise a question that was on my mind 40 years ago. And I was just thinking of it then, but I suppose now is a good time to ask it. After 40 years in the desert, enjoying all the intellectual stimulation of the desert. And that is, where is the practical outcome of all this? That is, I know that we have all enjoyed the dialogue and folks who participate in it have been very much broadened themselves in this. But if you look at the question of how has this effort affected court cases? I mean, have you been asked to testify as a special witness on any of these things and where a case came up? Same thing true about legislatures. When we're in the process of drafting law, are the people whom we've cultivated over the years actually been active in formulating legislative or judicial? Has there been an influence there that looking back now at the end of 40 years, you can say, well, we did that?
So Oliver Wendell Holmes has this wonderful quote that all the great questions of theology, philosophy, and morality must come to law for their resolution. And it's an overstatement for a reality that law is left to kind of resolve some of society's hardest questions. And it does so in part through legislation and regulation, and it does so in part through case law. Concordats, covenants, contracts, and so forth have an influence too, but we ultimately have to make decisions. We can talk about stuff all day as theologians and philosophers, but a decision has to be made. Do we execute or not execute? Do we change the form of marriage or not change the form of marriage? Do we hold for this party or that party? And the Solomonic solution of cutting the baby in half is not something that's easily available to lawyers when they're in this business. And so one of the things that the rise of the Law and Religion Guild has helped do is to create a group of about 800 specialists in this country that are now in the business of bringing cases and serving as amicus writers, helping helping lawyers in shaping religious freedom litigation, working on hard questions around everything from zoning to bankruptcy to dietary laws to workplace regulations to all the quiet things under the radar that are a critical part of the protection of religious liberty in this country. In the last 30 years, there have been about 2,390, we have counted, sorry, such nerds, 2,390 particular provisions at the federal, state, and local level to protect the religious freedom of individuals or groups, or to protect religious freedom qua religious freedom. It is a guild-driven statutory framework that's emerged. And folk have basically said, we're going to have to be actively involved in this. Every year, the U.S. Supreme Court takes on 3 or 4 or 5 major religious freedom cases. And for every one of those religious freedom cases, the Law and Religion Guild is very actively involved in arguing the cases and writing briefs for the cases and being amicus writers for the briefs in the cases and actively involved in shaping the legislation. Cases don't just show up in court. cases are very much orchestrated. And the orchestration of religious liberty is a deliberate tie between the academy and the bench and the bar. And these cases emerge with quite careful interaction between the learned scholar and the practicing lawyer. At the international level, the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the European Union, both of which, in my view, have recently kind of toddled away from the protection of religious freedom. Their original jurisprudence was driven by judges, half of whom at least were people of faith who were trained in the law and religion guild on both sides. And if you look at apex courts in most Western European lands, you can say the same thing. It's the House of Lords that includes bishops sitting in the UK that are making final Supreme Court decisions for the UK and for the 57 countries that are part of the British Commonwealth. Legal guild that is informed by religious ideas and identities, that is shaped by this law and religion conversation, is very much in the game of making this stuff real. The scholarship that we produce in law review articles and op-eds and books and book series, that's raw material that courts and legislatures use. Sometimes that's material that we will share in expert opinions in cases, sometimes in hearing before legislative committees. There are a number of people in the law and religion world who have that as their bread and butter. They have a job in the university, but they do a lot of that themselves. I don't do much of it. Part of it is I'm not competent in a lot of these questions. Part of it is my chosen vocation is at my keyboard doing scholarship. But occasionally I have been involved. So there was a case in Canada a few years ago about whether they should lift the traditional prohibition on polygyny, excuse me. One man with multiple wives. And Canada had inherited from the common law tradition, which it had inherited from Roman law, the prohibition against having multiple wives concurrently. And Canada, liberal and edgy as it was, with its Human Rights Act, was thinking very seriously about whether they should lift that prohibition and allow for people of faith and non-faith to engage in polygamous unions as long as they were consensual. And my job as a historian, so-called expert in the history of marriage and family and sexuality, was to give an expert opinion to the Attorney General of Canada to reconsider the position that was being argued. And I gave long testimony and ended up writing a 600-page book on the Western case for monogamy over polygamy. And that ultimately persuaded the Canadian High Court to maintain the traditional prohibition. Those are little examples. You bring 500 other law and religion guys up here and gals up here, they'll all have their own stories of places where they can inject their expertise, even if it's pretty arcane, into the actual day-to-day working stuff. And then finally, I'd say, remember, we're training lawyers. We're training lawyers, and lawyers that are equipped to understand what the stakes are in the law and religion field, to be able to learn the basics of not just how to litigate cases, but to litigate cases with a level of refined understanding of what the interests are on both sides, the legal and the religious interests. That's one thing that we have produced, and we have, out of our Law and Religion Center, we've tried about 5,000 of these students in our courses over the years. And they're out there as practicing lawyers, and sometimes they show up as counsel in some of these cases. And these 55 other institutes in law and religion are doing some of the same thing. So I can duplicate examples, but it's not all just air and abstract. It's become quite a deliberate instantiation in institutional form, vindicating Holmes's idea. All the great questions of theology and philosophy and morality come to law for their resolution. Please, ma'am. I don't know your name. Forgive me.
So following up with Dr. Blumenthal's question, I was wondering if you have any specific examples about the Georgia legislature. So you if they are aware of the Emory Center, and you say they're lawyers or the guild, but do you have any specific examples of how you help the Georgia legislature? Or I'm just wondering if the Democrats in the legislature have consulted with you pleaded with you to come and give, counsel as to how they can cope with what's going on.
Yep. So good question. To keep it at home rather than, going around the world. Yes, we do have regular consulting relationships with a number of people in the House and the Senate and in the Georgia courts as well. They call us up usually off the record to ask for advice about this or that, to send them literature, to get them in touch with the right counsel. We do that pretty regularly. We as a center, qua center, don't do that. Individual colleagues do. We had a wonderful colleague in our center for a number of years called Mark Goldfeder, and he was very, very active in pushing religious liberty litigation in the Georgia courts and helping to shape what is now the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, finally enacted after his involvement initially. We have a lot of people who are doing really creative work in the child custody world. Our Barton Center for Child Advocacy is very much concerned in some of these interreligious dispute cases, custody, especially disputed custody, concerns about kidnapping of children and taking them abroad. We've been very actively involved on that side of things. We have not tried to shape legislation. We have not tried to lead counsel on any particular cases. That's not the way that we have felt we could be responsible to our more the national academic responsibility and vocation. But individual faculty certainly have, and many of our students are very actively involved in the legislature and in the courts, majority courts. Other questions, other comments, other quips? Professor McCauley, sir.
John, the center focuses on the relation of law and religion, but in the times that we're living in now, the further quarter that seems to sort of intervene here is politics. The perception is that the Supreme Court has become much more political in the last couple decades.
Yep.
Likewise, religion and politics have been wedded much more closely. I'm just wondering if you have a kind of, in the spirit of the broad programmatic presentation you made, I mean, some kinds of comments about how the center has addressed that question.
Yeah, so I mean, we've documented historical instances of what we've called theocracy and totalitarianism. We've documented many instances of earlier times when there is kind of body and overt and sometimes brutal forms of religious nationalism, and laying those historical examples on the table, put the current kind of posture of the current administration in some historical relief. Not the first time it's happened, it's not the last time it's going to happen. And one of the things that history offers you is both a diagnostic tool to figure out what's going on, but also a source of hope. Because notwithstanding the crisis that many of us feel that we are in now, a crisis of a rule of law, a crisis of a kind of religion political compound that's rather scary, a kind of both rhetorical bombast, but also institutional wrecking ball kind of posturing that the current administration is taking. There are many historical examples of that, and institutions do survive. One of the things that we try to do as constitutional lawyers is we have about 1,850 of us constitutional lawyers that work in law schools, and we're all now part of a national guild. Some people not, some people are involved in writing amicus briefs, pressing as many cases as possible so that the court gets flooded with petitions, well-positioned petitions that force the court to realize some of the stakes that are in place. And there's always a rule of thumb: if you can create division in the circuit courts between two courts, you may get a case in the Supreme Court. You can have three different approaches by the circuit courts. The federal court's right below the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to take the issue. And there is a rather orchestrated body of constitutional litigation going on now, or even relatively uninformed academics like I, who work in the field. We spend 5 to 10 hours a week writing amicus briefs and doing pieces of it and trying to get the courts to begin to realize what the stakes are. I dare say Some of those lower court cases are signs of encouragement. We rarely hear about the ones that are not sexy. But there's a lot of litigation going on that is challenging some of the, in my view, particularly pernicious violations of basic rule of law and basic constitutional law that's going on. And I'm not particularly political, I'm a centrist, but even I, as a centrist and a guy who doesn't like getting into these day-to-day frays, now I've gotten my dander up. The few hairs I have left are standing up, and we're beginning to press pretty hard with my colleagues. I don't want in that context to betray what is my vocation as a scholar, and I don't want to betray the center's own apolitical, not weenie, but apolitical posture on doing law and religion work. And we're playing to the gifts that we have. And amongst the things we have are individuals who can do some of these things on their own, and then a center that is in the business of trying to map things. We've got half a dozen proposals in front of big foundations to say, there are some big kind of questions that we need to get the polity ready for in the next 5 or 6 years, even though the next 2 or 3 or 4 years may be difficult. And we're thinking hard about what those look like. Please, madam.
You just alluded to getting things ready. What kinds of things are you thinking are coming in the future?
So using our old traditional tools, rethinking what federalism actually means and what state power, local state power can mean, and those laboratories of reconsideration, looking at the ways by which we think about the place of executive orders in a polity, and recognizing that the executive order power that is accreted over the last 25 years really betrays some constitutional fundamentals that we have to rethink anew. Thinking very hard about how to orchestrate litigation in the state courts and in the federal courts, and trying to create cases that are going to move along. Reimagining what religion-state relationships look like when the modern welfare state is no more. How do we take care of the least of these in society? Classic poor, widow, orphans, and strangers and sojourners in our midst. How do we take care of them when the state is no longer there to take care of them, or has, for ideological or fiscal or other reasons, kind of abandoned its brief for that least advantaged part of society, which it has taken on for the last century? How do we imagine kind of a post-welfare state and the place that religious communities play within it? All of those things are among the things that we're fussing with. And those are going to take some big thinking, structural thinking, of which law and religion is only a piece, but an important piece, given the place of those fundamental institutions in society. Please, Professor Sheth. Here comes the devastating question. David Blumenthal will answer this.
Given the existing and increasing people mobility, and therefore the diversity of religions in a given jurisdiction.
Yep.
How do you manage? Because you see, you take Indian religions. Hinduism is on the rise outside of India. Buddhism, of course, spread with the help of the emperor to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, as we call it, to Thailand, etc. It's worldwide. Happening with Jainism right now. Jainism is the next major wave of religion from the East, going all over the world. What I find interesting is that the religion is such a versatile institution. It knows how to adapt locally. Therefore, you have all these flavors of religion rather than the umbrella. The name may be the same, the practice may vary significantly by localizing it. Now that then gets into the jurisdiction issue, the law. How do you get the law to localize it?
So the
Question.
So Professor Sheth is interested in the fact that many religions in our day of growing porous boundaries and the ability to flow from our traditional geographical areas has now resulted in a number of different communities, including communities from the East, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, spreading into other polities as minorities and sometimes as majorities. And in the new context in which they find themselves, diversifying their practices, sometimes their beliefs, sometimes their associations in ways that are very different from what they are at home. And two questions I think are implicit in that. One question is, what do we do about those multitude of expressions of forms of faith? And then what do we do as states in thinking about those multiple expressions of forms of faith? And so I don't know if I captured your question properly. But thank you. No, well done. So I think you're right. I mean, there is this massive, I think, massive globalization of religion. It's changing a little bit now with borders that are getting a little firmer in the European Union and individual nation states, the kind of new nationalisms that emerge, the kind of ugly rhetoric about the foreigner that both deters people from coming, but also makes them perhaps look elsewhere. So I think it's not the free flowing of peoples and faiths that we had even 10 or 15 years ago. Whether that's good or ill is a different question, but that's, I think, changed. But the reality is we have diverse expressions of multiple forms of faith, including Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism from the East that are now in place in Western Europe, in Africa and Latin America, and in the United States. This Calvinist Congregationalists loves that in the sense that, look, I come out of a community that's a city-state religion. At most, ideally a congregational religion. And the diversity is actually a good thing rather than a bad thing for people of my ilk. We're Congregationalists and we like diversity and we believe there are kind of core and penumbra, dogma and adiaphora, essentials and non-essentials, but you can have a diversity of expressions of one form of faith, which in my view is healthy rather than harmful. Others have very different kind of mentalities about that. But in polities that adhere to religious freedom, and with or without an established religion, whether Anglicanism in England or Lutheranism in Nordic lands or Orthodoxy in Greece or Catholicism in Western Europe, every 21st century Western liberal land provides religious freedom presumptively for every peaceable form of faith. And a traditional Jain and a new edgy enculturated form of Jainism are both welcome. And indeed, one of the important things that we see in the later 20th and early 21st century, in the United States at least, is for all of the pernicious things that Professor Macaulay and I were talking about, we do have a robust religious freedom jurisprudence. And we all of a sudden, through statutes and through First Amendment cases, have found ourselves providing religious freedom for the unusual, the exotic, the Santorians doing ritual slaughtery in the city of Hialeah, a Muslim inmate sitting in an Arkansas prison who wants to grow a beard, Wiccan groups that want to have tax exemption. We're doing a lot of kind of creative, edgy protections of religious freedom, which makes the traditional Jain and the new form Jain, the traditional Buddhist and the new form Buddhists very welcome in our polity. And the issue, I think, is whether that religious freedom is going to be itself circumscribed by some of the new belligerence that we hear rhetorically in our culture and some of the belligerence that is part of our other branches of government's activity. And that's the part that's worrisome. So far, we have relatively robust religious freedom, and indeed more than 10 or 15 years ago, ironically. But as Mahatma Gandhi once said, a nation's dedication to religious freedom is measured by how it treats its most hated minorities. And ask Scientologists or Wiccans, ask post 9/11 Muslims, ask for a while Jews, and ask any other group, fill in the blanks. And many times on that measure, there's always a scapegoat or two or three, the most hated minority that gets singled out and subject to various kinds of restriction. In Western Europe, I'll finish the point and then get back. In Western Europe, the story is not nearly so good. Right. Because Western Europe, at the apex court level in each individual nation state, see Belgium and France in particular, Turkey a bit too, but also in the pan-European courts in Strasbourg and Luxembourg, religious minorities are getting hammered. I mean, the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights in 4 cases in the last 5 years have basically said Belgium's decision to ban ritual slaughtering practices of halal and kosher are fine. They can find meat somewhere else. Maybe they should go somewhere else to find meat that they don't. Right? There's this cutting, these legislations cutting to the heart of the identity of the Muslim and Jewish citizens of Belgium, basically saying animal welfare trumps. And you can find example after example like that in the recent cases. Conservative Christians too, with their strange views about heterosexual monogamous marriage. No job for you. All the edgy stuff. Now in those countries and at the apex, at the pan-European court level, they're doing poorly. Soft religion that is not particularly robust, or traditional religion of the majority, they do okay, as long as they don't get too uppity. Edgy stuff, sorry, that's problematic. Forgive me, I was going on too long.
Sitting on the board of a very large multinational with 250,000 employees worldwide. And as a career mobility, they are placed in geographies, both religious as well as jurisdictional law, which are strange to them as a career path. So you may go from one Christian faith-based organization or a jurisdiction to go to Islam-based or Jewish-based.
Yep.
And corporations at the board level, we debate about these issues because we look at the welfare of the career of the individual as a way of making a global CEO essentially.
Yep,
How do you manage that?
that's hard. I mean, there's no easy solution to that. I mean, the fact is that more than 100 of the 198 states and territories, independent states and territories around the world, have religious-based legal systems that govern in whole or in part the basic commerce, the basic activities, the basic marriage and family, charity, educational systems of these host countries. That's half the world.
Exactly.
And then if you think about it as less about the religious valence and enforcement mechanisms of those communities, and instead simply look at this as, look, there are all kinds of different legal regimes out there, and these legal regimes have various sources, various dimensions, various ways of being and doing, and you have to adjust to the legal environment you're around. Think of trees growing in the light. Sometimes you grow this way, sometimes you grow that way in light of what you're going to find. And in some sense, that's what professionals, especially global professionals like the ones you're representing on your board, they're going to have to find themselves in those kind of difficult contexts. And what you as a board have to, I think, have as one of your responsibilities is to make sure you don't put people that are too obtuse, who don't know the language, who are not appreciative of the culture, who can't engage those communities. It's not fair to them to put them in that context where they're simply foreign and can't engage. It's not good for them empirically, but it's also not good for the business in the end. But you have a big community like you're running, you've got to be able to find the culturally and linguistically adept to be able to put them in the context where they may be operating under Sharia for things and Sharia banking laws for some things, and a Hindu kind of practice in other parts of the world, and a Christian kind of presupposition about the way culture works in others. We have nimble citizens and we have people that can wear multi-confessional hats, but those people they tend to have a grounding, and that grounding can be challenged by a very different kind of religiously grounded legal system that they get exposed to.
One more question.
Of course, this is your forum, my friend.
This is US centric.
Yep.
We find that at the jurisdiction, let's say county level, judges sitting, making judgments on a given case, they don't seem to be as diverse as the population within that county.
Hmm.
How do you manage that?
So as diverse in terms of their demography.
In that county,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
So
So,
diversity of population is much greater than the diversity of the lawyers and the
Yeah.
judges.
so one of the, in my view, pernicious things is that we elect judges.
Yeah.
Rather than have judges appointed. And that's a pretty elementary misstep in my view about doing checks and balances and separation of powers, because what happens is you have a tyranny of the majority, which informs both the legislature and the legislation that emerges, but you often will also have a tyranny of the majority that selects the judges who are interpreting that tyranny of the majority legislation. That, in my view, is dangerous. One system that has worked in a number of states is to say we can have statewide election of our Supreme Court or a high court bench, but we're going to have appointments for the courts below. That has been an effective remedy for some of this problem of micro communities being managed by a tiny majority that keeps on putting one of their guys in place. A second solution that's worked is to abolish the state election system and make it simply an appointment system. But the difficulty with that system is what we have seen at the federal level, right? I mean, it's whatever political party is in place, especially if there's a majority in the Senate, now is going to, if it, and it matches the party of the president, it becomes a very political process, which it shouldn't be. A third solution that's beginning to be discussed pretty amply is an academy bar and bench alliance, which the three groups, the academics, the sitting judges, and the practicing bar, work together to nominate, select, and then appoint, sometimes for at least a probationary period, the judges from all the way down to at the county level, all the way up to the Supreme Courts of states, but all the way down to administrative law judges running the immigration and regulatory state, all the way up to the courts of appeal. And that's taking off as an idea. It's going to take some real important state constitutional and federal judicial rule revisions to make that work, but people are fed up. The judges themselves are fed up because they've carried the stigma of being, simply a stooge of the majority. Their judgments are always tempered in part by, especially as election season comes along, how this is going to play in the papers. The transparency of the internet has made every one of their moves visible to all, and the manipulation of the data around all of those moves makes it even harder for them to kind of operate. So the judge who wants to be a judge is hamstrung as a consequence. I have a friend of mine who is a classmate, actually, who is a district judge in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a straight appointment system for its state judges. He was a Superior Court judge, and they have one of these combined academic and bench and bar groups that helps the selection of the judges, and they have an ongoing 3-year review every 3 years. It's 3 years, the first 1 year, the first year, 3 years, then 5 years, but then 5 years thereafter for as long as they sit. And the review is strenuous. And he said it was fabulous. And the bench in Massachusetts, not knowing these mechanics, bench in Massachusetts has produced fabulous judgments. And I dare say it's a consequence. So the structural fixes are there. The political will to implement them is the hard part. Other questions? Am I taking too much? Oh my God.
Morning, John.
Yep.
So I know you said you didn't want this to be autobiographical. But from your presentation, I can see your path as you've taken it and flourished. Beginning with a powerful role that Alberta played in your life.
Yep.
at him with the beforehand. That being said, I'm curious, if there's anything you might want to point to in your life beforehand, at Calvin College or even before, that might have set you on the path that you found yourself.
Well, now you're asking me to betray my humility. I was born in a immigrant family, Dutch immigrant family in Canada. My parents were Dutch immigrants who came over after World War II. They had met in the underground in the Netherlands, fighting the Nazi occupation. They had risked life and limb to spirit Jews and dissidents out of the Netherlands in little sailboats across the English Channel to their English counterparts. They had engaged in unspeakably dangerous acts, which as teenagers they thought were just the things you had to do. And that produced a level of courage, a level of faith, a level of respect for the other in their lives and in our lives. They came over with my dad after the war, fought for 3 years in Indonesia in the Dutch army. Every boy who didn't have parents, both his parents were killed by the Nazis. Both his parents, with his parents gone, every boy that didn't have any kind of home or connection was sent down to Indonesia to fight in the War of Independence that the Dutch colonizers were now facing with the local population. Spent 3 years there. We found out only in the last 2 years of his life really what went on there and the horrible things that he went through. And what saved his life several times physically and emotionally and spiritually was a Catholic priest, which for Dutch Calvinists was the Beelzebub of the religious profession. And he had this quiet toleration throughout his life for the different, the other. We were brought up from frugality, honestly, hard work. I've been working since I'm 5 years old and taught to appreciate things. At a little 1,000-square-foot house, which I grew up with my brothers and sisters. We brought in a little deeply handicapped brother who died at the age of 16, succumbed to all manner of different brain ailments. And from that experience and my parents' constant attention to the different, the other, the widow, the single mother, were very different in our community. Always at our supper table, babies always in the cradles, crowded in our living room. We grew an appreciation, extraordinary appreciation for love and justice and tolerance for everybody, no matter who they are. I think early on that kind of imbued in me a desire to be, to do something that would be helpful to other folks, consistent with my gifts such as I had them. And to work hard and to kind of find my way. So I went to Calvin College, a little religious college, sponsored by the Dutch Calvinist community. Studied history, philosophy, and biology. Was pre-med, pre-law, and pre-graduate school. Did GRE, MCAT, and LSAT, got into all three, and then had to decide what to do. And I kind of left it to the good Lord. And what I ended up doing was writing to Hal Berman as a young punk coming out of Calvin College, and told him these are my options and what should I do. And he said, come study with me. And that was the start of a wonderful relationship. I had read a lot of his stuff as an undergrad. I learned about the law and religion field from him a little bit. I've been reading a lot of history, a lot of religious history. And I went to Harvard Law School. I worked with him 40 hours a week while going to school full time. All the old Dutch industry was alive and well, thank you. And from there, I picked up the story that I told, which is to come down here. And I'm a simple-minded Protestant who believes that the good Lord kind of guides your life. And I have kind of left all these things to prayer and to opportunity. And I came to Emory thinking I'd be here for a few years and then I would move on. And every time I had an opportunity to go somewhere else, including some very fine schools, including my alma mater, to join the faculty. Every time that happened, the good Lord would just open up a floodgate. The huge grant that you helped us get, a whole new book series that Cambridge wanted me to create, a new kind of opportunity to do something that couldn't be done anywhere else. And every time that happened, about 5 or 6 times, if you want to be a dean or a provost or a president of a small religious college, those things came along. In every instance, there was kind of a pretty obvious sign. Gideon with his fleece, that told me, yeah, stay where you are. Stay where you are. So I'm going to stay here for 40 more years, and then the next call that comes along, I'm going to answer it. So thank you for letting me embarrass myself by telling you my story.
Well, thank you for taking.
Thank you, Professor Sheth, Mrs. Sheth, for your kindness in sponsoring this. Thanks to Ann and to Glenn and others for